It is the 9th of January 1932, and a man is lying on his stomach in the dirt on a hilltop in southern Mexico, looking into a hole he has just made in a roof. The hole is small, perhaps the width of 2 hands. Below it is a room, and the room is dark, and the air coming out of it is colder than the air on the hill. His name is Alfonso Caso. He is 35 years old. 3 days earlier, his crew had been clearing rubble from a low mound north of the main plaza. Routine work, the kind that produces broken pottery and little else, when a shovel struck cut stone where there should have been none. He lowers a lamp on a cord. The light swings. It catches masonry. It catches a floor. And then it catches something that stops him. Because in every other tomb on this hill, in all 170 of them, someone has been there first. Robbers, colonists, farmers, time. Not this one. The floor of the chamber is covered in objects. Gold, worked so thin it moves in the draft from the opening. Silver, pearls, jade, rock crystal. Jaguar bones carved with a story along their length, line after line, like a book laid out flat. And in the middle of it, a human skull, its face entirely covered in turquoise. Caso will spend the next weeks lifting more than 400 objects out of that room. It becomes, overnight, one of the richest burials ever opened in the Americas. Newspapers on 3 continents will call it a treasure. But that word is wrong, and Caso knows it is wrong, because nobody buried this man to hide his wealth. Every single object in that chamber was placed there deliberately by people who were still alive, who had to find it, carry it, and give it up. Somebody made those gold pieces, somebody carved those bones over months. Somebody stood in that room in the 14th century in the dark and decided that the dead man needed all of it more than they did. Which raises a question the treasure hunters never asked. Who paid for that funeral? And is anyone still paying? This is Oaxaca, a state in the south of Mexico, roughly the size of Portugal, folded 3 times over by mountains, holding more languages, more species, and more separate self-governing communities than anywhere else in the country. 8,400 plant species, more than 700 kinds of bird, more reptiles and amphibians than any other Mexican state. 16 recognized indigenous peoples, and more than 50 variants of Zapotec alone, some of which cannot understand each other across a single mountain range. And a reputation abroad for 3 things: food, mezcal, and a festival about death that photographs well. All 3 are real. None of them is the story. Because if you stay past the festival, if you are still there in March or in July, on an ordinary Tuesday in a village of 900 people, you will eventually hear a brass band start up in the middle of the afternoon. It will not be a celebration. Nobody will be dancing. Somebody has died, and the village has approximately 2 hours to reorganize itself around that fact. In most of the world, a funeral is an appointment. You take a day, you wear dark clothes, you go back to work. In a Zapotec village in the valley of Oaxaca, a funeral is closer to a public works project. It begins within hours of the death, because there is no embalming and no waiting. The body is washed and dressed at home in the front room, and by nightfall that room is full, not of family, of the village. Neighbours arrive with candles, with bread, with chocolate, with cases of beer and bottles of mezcal, and they do not leave. That first night is called the velorio. It runs until dawn. Rosaries are said in Spanish and in Zapotec, one after another in shifts, so the prayer never actually stops. In the courtyard, women who arrived without being asked are already cooking for 100 people, because 100 people are going to need feeding tomorrow and the day after. The second day, the village arrives properly. Relatives come down from the mountains and up from the coast. The band is engaged. The grave is dug, by hand, by men from the neighborhood, not by anyone paid to do it. The third day is the Mass, the procession, and the burial. The coffin is carried through the streets on shoulders, the band walking in front of it, playing slowly. The whole town stops. Shops close. And afterward, everybody eats together. "3 days. That is the answer the title promises, and it is true. It is also, in Oaxaca, only the opening phase, because after the burial come 9 consecutive nights of rosaries at the family home, the novenario, and on the 9th night, in the Central Valleys, something extraordinary happens on the floor. Dozens of people gather to build a picture out of sand, sawdust, and colored pigment laid directly on the ground. Red from an insect, blue from a plant. Some of these funeral tapestries measure 11 meters along a side. They take an entire day to make, and they exist for a matter of hours before they are lifted, swept up, and gone. Then a year of mourning, then a mass at 1 year, the Cabo de Año, which formally closes it. So the honest answer to how long a funeral lasts here is not 3 days. It is 3 days, then 9 nights, then a year. And somebody, as in that tomb on the hill, has to pay for all of it. Not in money. That part comes later, and it is stranger than money. To understand why an entire state organizes itself this way, you have to start where the objects in Tomb 7 came from, which means starting on the hill itself. Monte Alban sits 400 meters above the valley floor, on a ridge where 3 arms of the Valley of Oaxaca converge. From the top, you can see all 3 at once: every road, every river, every settlement. But it was not a ridge when they started. It was an uneven mountain spur, and around 500 years before the Common Era, somebody decided it needed to be flat. So they flattened it, by hand, cutting the high ground down and using the spoil to build the low ground up, until they had a level artificial plaza 300 meters long, aligned to the movements of the sky, which produced an immediate problem. There is no water on top of a mountain. Every drop that entered Monte Alban, for drinking, for cooking, for the lime plaster that coated its buildings, had to come up the slope on somebody's back, or be caught in cisterns, cut into the rock, and rationed through the dry season. At its height, the city held perhaps 17,000 people, all of them drinking water that had been carried or saved. That single decision to build up here, away from the fields and the rivers, shapes everything that follows. A city that cannot feed itself must be supplied. A city that must be supplied needs tribute. Tribute needs an accounting system, so they built one. A script carved into stone, one of the earliest writing systems in the Americas, and a calendar to run it by. Tribute also needs enforcement, and on the western edge of the plaza, there are more than 300 carved slabs showing human figures, contorted, eyes closed, that the Zapotec set into a wall for anyone arriving to walk past. The archaeology is not sentimental about what those figures represent. And then there is the part of Monte Alban that people walk over without noticing. The tombs are not in a cemetery. There is no cemetery. The tombs are underneath the houses. Beneath the patios of the residential compounds, reached through the floor, the Zapotec built chambers for their dead and then went on living directly above them. Some were reopened repeatedly across generations, the bones of earlier occupants pushed aside to make room. A few have painted walls, figures in procession, still legible after 1,500 years. The dead did not leave the household. They were furniture of a kind. You cooked above your grandmother. The Zapotec called themselves the Beina Za, the cloud people, and held that the dead returned to the clouds that made them. But the clouds were not far away. They sat on the ridgeline every morning of the rainy season, at eye level, close enough to walk into. After about 700 of the Common Era, Monte Alban began to empty. Not violently. Construction stopped. The population thinned and moved down into the valley towns, and by 900, the hilltop was no longer a city. It remained a burial ground. Which is why, 6 centuries later, a Mixtec lord was carried up a mountain everyone had already abandoned and laid in a Zapotec tomb that had been sealed for 400 years with 400 objects and a turquoise face, by people who understood exactly whose house they were putting him in. The red on some of those objects and the red in nearly everything else Oaxaca has ever exported came from something you would step on without seeing. On the flat green pads of the nopal cactus, in the dry country east of the city, there are patches of what looks like white mold. Scrape one with a fingernail, and it crushes into a red so intense it stains the skin for a day. It is not mold. It is an insect. Dactylopius coccus, the cochineal, and the white is a wax coat it secretes over itself for protection. The female is the one that matters. She has no wings and, after her first days of life, no real interest in movement. She pushes a beak into the cactus pad, locks on, and stays there, drawing sap and converting it into carminic acid, up to a quarter of her dried body weight, which she uses to make herself taste appalling to ants. Roughly 70,000 of them are required to produce a single kilogram of dye. They are brushed off the pads by hand, boiled, dried in the sun until they weigh a third of what they did, and ground to powder. Nobody has ever found a way to do this quickly. The trade that this insect built collapsed in the late 19th century when European chemists learned to make red in a factory. Within a generation, a global industry became a village craft practiced by a handful of families. It did not disappear. It waited. And when the world became nervous about synthetic colorings in food and cosmetics, the demand came back for the same insect, harvested from the same cactus, by hand, at the same rate it has always been harvested. Remember the red. It comes back at the end of this. "40 kilometers east of Monte Alban, where the valley narrows and the land turns to scrub and agave, there is a place the Zapotec called Lioba. The word means the resting place, the place of burial. The Nahuatl speakers who arrived later rendered it as Mictlan, their own word for the land of the dead, and the Spanish shortened that to what it is called now, Mitla. What stands there is unlike anything else in the Americas. The walls of the palaces are covered in geometric fretwork, stepped frets, spirals, meanders, assembled from tens of thousands of individually cut stones, set into the facade without mortar. Each piece is shaped so precisely that it holds by pressure alone. There is no plaster hiding a mistake because there is no room for one. Nobody has found a comparable technique anywhere else on the continent, and underneath the complex, the accounts say there was something else. 16th century chroniclers describe a chamber beneath the buildings, a passage leading down, into which the Zapotec placed their high dead, and which the living entered on certain days. The dominant priest of the Zapotec, the Huiatao, lived here. Mitla was not a city. It was an administrative center for the afterlife. It is 1553. The Dominicans have been in the valley for 2 decades, and their patience with Mitla has run out. They come with orders and with labor. The subterranean passage is filled and sealed. The chroniclers write that it was closed off so that nobody could go down again. Stone is taken from the palace walls, and on the ground immediately beside the fretwork, using its own masonry, they raise a church. The Church of San Pablo still stands there. It is not a ruin. It has a congregation. Walk the site today, and you cross from mortarless Zapotec geometry to Catholic stonework in about 15 paces, and the two are built from the same rock. The friars had a stated goal, and they achieved part of it. They stopped the ceremonies. They closed the passage. What they could not do was stop the underlying logic, that the dead remain part of the household, that they are owed food and attention, and that the living have a standing obligation to them. So the church did what the church has always done when eradication fails. It rescheduled. Indigenous observances for the dead were aligned with All Saints and All Souls on the 1st and 2nd of November. Crosses were placed on the woven mats. Copal resin was burned instead of frankincense. Prayers were said in Latin, in Spanish, and in Zapotec, in the same room, in the same hour. It is often described as a compromise. From the Oaxacan side, it looks more like a successful negotiation. 30 kilometers west, in the flat center of the valley, there is a city that exists because of a mistake about gold. The Aztecs got there first. In 1486, they built a garrison at the point where the valley's 3 arms meet and called it Huaxacac, the place at the nose of the gourd tree, to watch a trade route they did not control the ends of. In November of 1521, a Spanish captain named Francisco de Orozco took the valley in the name of the crown. Hernán Cortés, still in the north, immediately declared the whole thing his own and had himself titled Marqués del Valle de Oaxaca. He wanted the mineral deposits. He argued about the city's legal standing for a decade, until Charles V ruled against him and made it an independent town. Cortés never found meaningful gold in Oaxaca. By 1560, the settlement had around 500 Spanish residents. It was a provincial nowhere. And then, in the 1570s, they began building Santo Domingo. The church took the better part of 40 years. Inside, the vaulted ceiling carries more than 100 gilded figures in high relief, a genealogical tree growing out of the reclining body of a Spanish nobleman, every leaf and branch worked in gold. The adjoining monastery is now the State Museum. Tomb 7 sits in it, the turquoise skull, the gold, the carved bones, about 8 kilometers from the hillside they came out of. The building is usually explained as an expression of Spanish wealth arriving in a poor province. That explanation has the direction of travel backwards. Very little of what paid for Santo Domingo came from Spain. It came out of the valley, and it came out of the cactus. Within decades of the conquest, cochineal had become the second most valuable export leaving New Spain, behind silver and ahead of everything else. It was cultivated almost entirely in indigenous households in Oaxaca and the country immediately north of it, by families producing it under tribute obligations and forced credit arrangements they had not asked for. Spain guarded the source so closely that for 2 centuries, most European buyers did not know whether they were purchasing a plant, a mineral, or an animal. It colored cardinals' robes. It colored the uniforms of the British Army. It colored canvases that now hang in national galleries. It was produced by Zapotec and Mixtec women bent over cactus pads with a brush, 70,000 insects at a time. So when people say the gold ceiling in Santo Domingo is Spanish, they are describing the accounting rather than the labor. The valley paid for that room. It has simply never been listed as the donor. There is a second thing about Oaxaca City that visitors consistently misread, and it will matter later. It is the capital of a state where, in most of the territory, political parties do not appear on the ballot. There is no campaigning. In hundreds of Oaxacan towns, nobody is permitted to want the job. Which sounds like a description of a place with no politics. It is the opposite. But to see how it works, you have to leave the valley and climb. North of the city, the land goes vertical almost immediately. Within an hour, the agave and dust give way to pine, then to oak, then to cloud forest, a band of mountain between 2,000 and 3,000 meters where the air holds water permanently and the trees carry gardens on their branches. This is where Oaxaca's numbers come from. The state sits at a collision. The Sierra Madre de Oaxaca runs down from the north. The Sierra Madre del Sur comes along the Pacific, and they meet just before the land narrows to the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, the slimmest point in the country, 200 kilometers of ground between the Pacific and the Gulf. Species moving north and species moving south have been funneled through that gap for millions of years and then trapped in the mountains on either side of it, valley by valley, until they became something else. The Nahuatl name for that narrow place is Tehuantepec, Jaguar Mountain. The animal in the name is still there. In the Chimalapas forest on the eastern edge of the state, one of the largest surviving tracts of tropical forest in Mexico, held not by the government, but by 2 indigenous communities, jaguars are documented alongside tapir, puma, otter, and 3 species of mouse found nowhere else on Earth. A jaguar needs enormous territory. A male may range across 100 square kilometers alone, largely at night, and the forest has to be continuous for that to work. Fragment it, and the animal is finished, not because you shot it, but because you cut its map into pieces, which makes the Chimalapas a fairly precise measurement of something. The forest is intact because the communities who own it decided in assembly that it would be. Not a park, not a policy, a vote taken by people who live there. Across Oaxaca, communities hold close to 80% of the land. Hundreds of them have voluntarily designated parts of it for conservation, adding up to more protected ground than the federal reserves in the state. Which brings us back to the question of who is allowed to want the job. 417 of Oaxaca's 570 municipalities, nearly 3/4, are governed under a system the Mexican Constitution recognizes as usos y costumbres, uses and customs. In those towns, there are no party candidates and no campaigns. Decisions are made in a general assembly that any adult member of the community can attend and speak in. Leadership is not won, It is assigned. The system is called the cargo, the load, the burden, and it is exactly that. A young man begins with something small and unglamorous, sweeping the churchyard, carrying messages, serving as a topil, the community's unpaid constable. He does it for a year. Later, he is given something heavier, a committee, the water supply, the school, the band. Eventually, if he has discharged each load properly, the assembly may name him to the highest offices, including the presidency of the municipality. None of these positions is paid. Some require a year away from earning entirely. A man may be named to a cargo while working in another state or another country and be expected to come back. Refusing is possible. It is also socially close to unsurvivable. A family that will not serve loses standing, loses the labor of neighbors when it needs it, and in some communities loses rights to communal land. Alongside the cargo sits the tequio, from the Nahuatl word for tribute, which is unpaid collective labor owed by every household. Roads, water pipes, school walls, church roofs. 2 or 3 days a year called by the assembly, and everyone turns out. It is the reason a village of 800 people in the Sierra Norte can have an immaculate plaza, a functioning water system, and a paved access road on a municipal budget that would not cover any of it. The budget did not build those things, the village did, with its hands, on a Saturday. And the third leg of the structure is the one that pays for the funeral. It is called Huelaguetza, in some villages, Gozona, and it is usually translated as an exchange of gifts. That is not quite it. Huelaguetza is a ledger. When a family holds a wedding, a baptism, or a funeral, neighbors arrive carrying specific quantities of specific things. 20 kilos of maize, a crate of beer, 2 turkeys, cash, candles, and in many households, someone writes it down. Who came, what they brought, on what date. Because it is not a gift, it is a deposit. When the giver's own family holds an event, the debt is called in, and what returns is expected to match what was given, or to exceed it slightly. The ledgers are kept for decades. They are inherited. A woman may be repaying, at a funeral in 2026, an obligation her mother incurred in 1981. Which means that when someone dies in a Zapotec village, the family does not have to find the money for 3 days of food, a brass band, a grave, and 150 guests. The money is already out on loan, across the whole village, and it comes home. This is the answer to the question Alfonso Caso did not ask on that hilltop. Somebody paid for the man in Tomb 7, and the mechanism that paid for him was almost certainly not a treasury. It was a network of obligation between households, calling in what it was owed. One of those Sierra Norte villages is called Guelatao. It holds about 800 people on a shelf of mountain with a small lake below it. In 1806, a boy was born there who spoke only Zapotec. His parents died before he was 4. He worked as a shepherd. At 12, he walked the 60 kilometers down to Oaxaca City, arrived, unable to hold a conversation in Spanish, and went to work in a household as a servant. His name was Benito Juarez. He became a lawyer, then governor of Oaxaca, then, in 1858, president of Mexico. Hold that. His story does not end where the statues suggest it does, and the second half of it lands directly on the villages he came from. Back down in the valley, the land east of the city is dry, stony, and covered in a plant that looks like a defensive installation. Agave. Maguey. There are around 159 species in Mexico, and something like 125 of them can be made into mezcal. Most take between 6 and 12 years to mature. Some wild varieties take 25. The plant flowers once, at the end of its life, and dies. To make mezcal, you cut the leaves off, dig a pit, line it with hot stones, bury the hearts under earth for 3 or 4 days, then crush them, traditionally with a stone wheel dragged in a circle by a horse. Ferment them in wooden vats with wild yeast and distill twice. In 2010, Mexico produced about 1 million liters of it. By 2024, that figure was over 11 million. Roughly 3/4 of the exports go to the United States. For the villages of the Central Valleys, this should read as the best economic news in a century. A drink that was, within living memory, dismissed as what poor people drank when they could not afford tequila, is now sold in New York and London at prices that would have been unimaginable to the men who made it. And the effect on the ground has been close to the reverse. In the 2 main producing zones of Oaxaca, roughly 35,000 hectares of tropical dry forest and pine oak forest have been cleared in 27 years to plant agave, an area about the size of the city of Detroit. The plantations are single species. That matters more than it sounds. The traditional system here is the milpa, maize, beans, and squash grown together, with agave on the margins, each part supporting the others. A 3rd-generation producer in Santiago Matatlan, named Felix Monterosa, who runs a label called Quiche, put it plainly: the boom displaced the milpa his ancestors farmed, and now everything is monoculture, and that is the real problem. In his town, decades of dumping distillation waste into the river has left the water so foul that residents renamed it. They call it the Nilo, short for Nilo Huelas. Don't even smell it. Remember that river. And the prices for the people who actually grow the plant have collapsed. Small farmers in Oaxaca have watched what they earn per kilo of agave fall by around 80% in a single year, while the shelf price abroad did not move at all. 200 kilometers northwest, the ground itself tells a longer version of the same story. The Mixteca Alta is high, cold, and in places almost bare. From the air, whole hillsides show as pale scars, bedrock with the soil gone off it. It was not always like this. Before the conquest, these were terraced, worked, and densely populated uplands. The Mixtec were building city-states here while Monte Alban was still occupied, and their codices, painted on deer hide, folded like a screen, record dynasties across centuries. Then, the Spanish introduced sheep and goats in enormous numbers, on ground that had never carried grazing animals, followed by the plough. The vegetation went first, then the topsoil, which on a slope has nowhere to go but down. The result is one of the most severely eroded landscapes in Mexico, and it took about a century to make. What follows from stripped land is people leaving it. Oaxaca has been sending its population north for generations, to Mexico City, to Baja, to California, to the fields of Oregon and Washington. In one recent 5-year period, more than 34,000 people left the state, which produces a strange arithmetic in the villages. The money holding many of these communities together does not come from the land. It arrives by wire transfer from someone standing in a field 2,500 miles away. And that person is still on the ledger. There are villages in the Mixteca that have held a full 3-day funeral, with the band, the procession, and the meal, for a man who left at 19 and never came back, whose body was flown home, or in some cases, was not. Hold that too. Now go southeast, down to where the mountains give out. The Isthmus of Tehuantepec is flat, hot, and windy in a way that has to be experienced to be believed. Air pressure differences between the Gulf and the Pacific push through the gap in the mountains at Chivela Pass, the lowest crossing between the two oceans anywhere in the country, just 224 meters above sea level, and accelerate. The wind here is among the most reliable on the planet, which is why the ridgelines now carry hundreds of turbines. The largest town on the isthmus is Juchitán de Zaragoza, and it runs on a version of Zapotec that a speaker from the valley of Oaxaca cannot follow. Here is where an assumption usually gets in the way. Most people arrive with a medical picture of an indigenous language as something fragile, spoken by the elderly, in private, on the way out. Walk into the market at Juchitán. It is run by women. It has been run by women for as long as anyone can document, and the language of that market is Zapotec. Not sentimentally, commercially. Prices are quoted in it. Arguments are conducted in it. It is the language in which you are told your offer is insulting. The poet Natalia Toledo, born in Juchitán in 1968, writes in it and publishes in it. Not translations into Zapotec, but poems composed in Zapotec and then carried into Spanish afterwards. Her work is one of the reasons a younger generation started writing in the language again. Juchitán is also known for something that tends to surprise outsiders more than it surprises anyone local. Isthmus Zapotec society recognizes a third social role, the muche, neither man nor woman as those categories are usually drawn, occupying a defined and often honored position in family and ceremonial life. It is not new, it is not imported, and it long predates the vocabulary that visitors reach for to describe it. The point is not that Juchitán is exotic. The point is that it is functioning on its own terms, with its own categories, in its own language, in the present tense. West of there, where the Sierra Madre del Sur drops to the Pacific, the coast is a different country again. In the dry forest above the bays of Huatulco, there is an animal that most visitors never see because it is looking down at them from a branch. The northern tamandua is a tree-dwelling anteater about the size of a cat, with a prehensile tail, a coat like a pale sweater with a black vest across it, and no teeth whatsoever. It works by demolition. It finds an ant or termite nest in the canopy, tears it open with claws it has to walk on its knuckles to protect, and extracts the occupants with a tongue longer than its own head, coated in glue. It eats at a single nest for about a minute, then leaves. Not because it is full, because the soldiers have arrived and the bites are becoming intolerable. So it moves on, hits another nest, and never takes enough from any one colony to destroy it. An animal that has arrived by pure instinct at a harvesting rule the mezcal industry is currently learning the hard way. There is one more range to account for, and it is the highest ground in the state. East of the Sierra Norte, the mountains rise to Cerro Zempoaltepetl, more than 3,300 meters, often above the cloud, and sacred to the people who live on its flanks. They are the Mixe. They call themselves Ayujcjay, the people of the language of the mountains, and they are known throughout Mexico by a nickname that raises an obvious question. The never conquered.
The Aztecs pushed into Oaxaca
and could not hold the Mixe highlands. The Spanish came with cavalry, steel, and disease, and took the valleys in a season, and then spent the better part of 2 centuries failing to establish durable control up here. Part of the answer is simply the ground. These are not mountains with passes, they are folds of rock at brutal gradients, cut by ravines, wrapped in cloud for months at a time, where a road built in the dry season is a river in the wet one. The other part is that there was nothing to capture, No single capital, no king whose surrender would settle the matter. Authority sat in villages, in assemblies, in men holding cargoes for a year at a time. You cannot decapitate a system that has no head. You would have to conquer every settlement individually in terrain that punishes anyone carrying equipment. So a version of the old arrangement survived up here largely intact, and the people below the mountain still bring offerings to it. Between these ranges, the valley floor holds the things Oaxaca is photographed for. At Hierve el Agua, mineral-saturated springs run over a cliff edge and deposit calcium carbonate as they go, building a white formation that hangs down the rock face like a waterfall stopped mid-fall. It is not ice, and it is not water. It is 50 meters of accumulated mineral still growing. In a churchyard at Santa Maria del Tule stands a Montezuma cypress with the stoutest trunk measured anywhere on Earth, more than 40 meters around, so wide that the church behind it looks like a shed. At San Bartolo Coyotepec, they make pottery that comes out of the kiln black, without paint or glaze. The color is produced by burnishing the clay before firing it in a low-oxygen chamber, a technique a potter named Doña Rosa refined in the 1950s, and her family still works. And at Tlacolula on a Sunday, the market that has run on that spot since before the conquest fills with mold paste, mezcal sold by the liter, and toasted grasshoppers by the kilo. North of the city, at San Jose Mogote, there is a low mound in a field that was the most important settlement in the valley for 1,000 years before anyone thought of building on the hill. Almost nobody stops. Now put the pieces together, because the pressure they are under is arriving from several directions at once. It takes roughly 10 liters of water to produce 1 liter of mezcal. Run that against the export figures, and the mezcal shipped to the United States in a single recent year consumed something in the order of 72 million liters of water. In 2024, Oaxaca experienced its worst drought in more than a decade. That river in Santiago Matatlan, the one the neighbours renamed, is downstream of hundreds of small distilleries, each one legitimately trying to feed a family, none of them individually responsible for the state of the water. This is the shape of the problem. There is no villain in it. There is a global market that discovered a village product, and a landscape being asked to supply that market on terms it was never built for. And there is a precedent in Oaxaca for what happens when law arrives to fix something and takes something else with it. Benito Juarez, the shepherd from Guelatao, is remembered as the president who broke the power of the church over Mexico. He did. The reform laws of the 1850s forced corporations to sell land they held collectively and could not use. But under Mexican law of the period, an indigenous community was also a corporation. So the same statutes that pried the estates out of the hands of the bishops put communal village land, held in common, worked in common, the physical basis of the cargo and the tequio, onto the open market. Much of it was bought by people who already had a great deal. The dispossession accelerated for the next half-century under another Oaxacan president, Porfirio Diaz, until the country went to war with itself over it. The state that produced Mexico's 2 most consequential 19th-century presidents is also the state their policies cut deepest. And the willingness to shut a city down over a grievance did not go away. In May of 2006, the Oaxacan Teachers Union struck, as it did most years, and occupied the main square. Before dawn on the 14th of June, state police moved in with tear gas to clear the encampment.
The response was not what the government expected.
Within days, the teachers had been joined by students, unions, women's organizations, and delegations from indigenous communities, forming an assembly that took over the center of the city, occupied radio stations, and ran Oaxaca City behind barricades for months. Federal police retook the center at the end of October. Over roughly 7 months, at least 17 people were killed. More than 160 were arrested. Nothing was resolved. The governor served out his term. 28 kilometers east of the city, on the road that runs toward Mitla, there is a village of about 5,500 people, where roughly 3 in 4 households work with wool and dye. Teotitlán del Valle has been weaving since around 500 before the Common Era, first on backstrap looms with cotton and cactus fiber. In 1535, a Dominican bishop, Juan López de Zarate, brought in sheep and the first European treadle loom. The Zapotec here did not abandon their designs. They put pre-conquest geometry onto a Spanish machine and have been doing it ever since. Before sunrise, a master weaver named Samuel Bautista Lazo walks out with his mother into rows of prickly pear, and they begin going over the pads, brush in hand, gathering the white clusters. 70,000 insects to the kilo, only the females. The red in the rugs, the red in the church ceiling, the red on a British soldier's coat, and the red that will be laid on the ground in 9 days' time. All of it is being collected, by hand, in the half-dark, by 2 people who have not had breakfast. It is a Tuesday in the dry season, and at 11 in the morning, an old man dies in a house near the top of the village. By noon, 3 things have happened without anyone calling a meeting. A neighbor has gone to the church, and the bells have been rung, a specific pattern so that everyone within earshot knows there has been a death and knows roughly which quarter of the village it is in. A second neighbor has gone to the men who hold the cargo of the band this year. And in 4 or 5 courtyards, women have started counting what they have in the house, because they are about to be cooking for 200 people for 3 days. Nobody has been hired. The family has not asked. The ledger is simply being called in. By 2 o'clock, the body has been washed and dressed in the front room. There is no embalming, no funeral home, no professional between the household and the dead man. His daughters do it. He is laid out with candles at the 4 corners and a cross of flowers on the floor beneath him. Somebody puts a woven blanket over the lower half of the coffin, dyed with cochineal, made in this house by him or by his father. By 4, the courtyard is full and the arrivals have begun. They come in with maize, with chocolate, with bread, with mezcal, with candles, with money, folded into a small envelope. At a table by the gate, a relative writes each one down. Name, what they brought, how much. That book is the reason the family can afford this. And that book is also why, in 8 years or 11 years or 30, this family will be walking up somebody else's path with 20 kilos of maize. The rosary starts at 8 and does not stop. It runs in shifts through the night, Spanish and Zapotec alternating, one group taking over as another goes to sit down. Coffee and mezcal circulate continuously. Nobody sleeps in the house. People come, sit for 2 hours, and go home to rest so they can come back. This is the velorio. Its entire function is that the family is never alone in a room with the body. The second day is logistics on a scale that would take a professional planner a week. The grave is dug by men from the neighborhood, unpaid, taking turns. Relatives arrive from the coast, from Mexico City, from Los Angeles, on a flight booked in a panic. More food is cooked. The band rehearses the marches. Someone drives to the city for the coffin fittings. Someone else negotiates with the priest about the hour of the Mass. and none of these people are being paid, and none of them consider what they are doing to be a favor. The third day begins early. The Mass is at 10, with the coffin present at the front of the church. Afterwards, the doors open and the procession forms in the street. The band goes first. And here is what the brass is actually for. It is not a performance, and it is not hired entertainment. The band is a cargo, a community office, filled by young men of the village who serve their years playing at every funeral, every saint's day, every wedding, without payment. They are not playing for the family, they are the village, speaking. The music they play walking in front of a coffin is slow, in a minor key, and heavy on the low brass. It is designed to be heard from the far side of the valley. Anyone working in the fields 2 kilometers away will stop, look up, and know precisely what is happening and who it is for. The coffin is carried on shoulders, changing bearers every 50 meters along streets where every shop has closed. Behind it, several hundred people walk. At the cemetery, the grave is filled by the same men who dug it, by hand, while the band plays above them. And then everyone eats. In the courtyard, at long tables, at 2 in the afternoon, the whole village, the family, the relatives who flew in, and the men still dusty from the grave. Mole, tortillas, mezcal poured into small clay cups and passed along. 3 days. Then 9 nights of rosaries at the house, and on the 9th day in the courtyard, they begin laying the sand on the floor. Sawdust, sand, and pigment. Blue from indigo, red from the insect. Dozens of people working on their knees for most of a day to build a picture that may run several meters on each side. A cross, a saint, the man's name. They finish in the evening. The family prays over it, and then the cross that stood at the head of the coffin is lifted, and the whole thing is swept up and taken away. It exists for a few hours. Everybody involved knew that before they started. 600 years ago, on a hill about 8 kilometers from here, people who understood the same obligation carried a dead man up an abandoned mountain and gave him 400 objects they had made themselves, sealed the room, and went home. Alfonso Caso found the objects and called it a treasure. It was a receipt. What that means for Oaxaca now is genuinely unclear, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. The ledger that pays for the funeral requires people to be in the village. It requires a young man to be available for the cargo, and hands to be available for the tequio. And Oaxaca has been exporting its young men for 3 generations, to the north, to the fields, to the kitchens of American cities. Some of it adapts. Hometown associations in California collect for a village fiesta 4,000 kilometers away. Men serve cargoes by wire transfer, paying someone at home to do the physical work in their name. The obligation crosses the border. It simply becomes more expensive. Some of it does not adapt. There are villages in the Mixteca where the assembly is now old men because everyone else is in Fresno. And there are funerals held there, 3 days, the band, the procession, the meal, all of it. For a man who left at 19 and whose body came home in a box, to a village he had not walked through in 2 decades, paid for by an account his mother opened before he was born. High in the cloud forest of the Sierra Juarez, in community-protected woodland that no government designated, there is an animal you would need to be told about to notice. The minute salamanders of the genus Thorius are among the smallest 4-limbed animals alive. An adult can sit on a fingernail with room left over. They have no lungs at all. They take in oxygen directly through their skin, which is why they cannot leave the damp leaf litter and why a fractionally drier forest kills them. Oaxaca holds more of these species than anywhere on Earth, and a great many of them exist on a single mountain and nowhere else. Most are critically endangered. Several were described by science only after they had begun to vanish. They survive, where they survive, inside forest that a village voted to leave standing, by people who will never see one, protecting ground for reasons they would describe as obligation rather than conservation. Which is, in the end, the same instrument that buries the dead. Whether it holds is an open question. The water is running short. The forest is being cut for a drink the world has only just discovered. The young are leaving, and the market is not going to slow down to accommodate a village ledger. But somewhere in Oaxaca tonight, a bell is being rung in a pattern that means someone has died. And within the hour, without any of them being asked, 200 people will have started cooking. Thanks for watching, and see you on the next journey.